Welcome, everyone, to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Knight. I'm a manager with the LenFest Ocean Program. For those of you that do not know us, the LenFest Ocean Program is a grant-making program that funds research projects and expert working groups to address priority science needs facing ocean and coastal decision makers. And to learn more, visit us at lenfestocean.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and follow us at LenFestOcean on Twitter and Instagram. So for today's agenda, we are really excited to have Dr. Andre Punt, Dr. Tessa Francis, and Dr. Margaret Sipple of the Ocean Modeling Forum at the University of Washington. Andre and Tessa, along with Dr. Rob Williams of Oceans Initiative, are the co-chairs of a new working group on marine mammal bycatch. And Megzi Sipple is a member of that working group, and it also includes an interdisciplinary and international team of scientists. I will let Tessa, Andre, and Megzi share more of the details about the group, but the aim is to assist nations that are working to comply with the Marine Mammal Protection Act provision implemented by NOAA. The working group got underway in early 2018 and will span the next couple of years. So some webinar logistics. We have all the attendees muted, but make sure to mute yourself. With so many people on the line, this is just to prevent any feedback. For questions, we will have the researchers do their full presentation, then answer questions at the end. To submit a question, use the Q&A panel to type and submit your question. I will read it aloud at the end for the researchers to answer. You can submit questions at any time throughout the presentation, and we'll just keep track of the queue. Depending on how many questions there are, we may not get to them all. This will end right at 5, but we welcome folks to follow up with us. And on that, you can see my contact and Tessa's contact on the slide in front of you. As I mentioned, the purpose of the group is to assist nations seeking to comply with the rule. So the goal of this webinar is to just really begin raising awareness about the working group and encourage folks to reach out. The speakers today are going to describe the products that the working group will produce, and we are more than happy to facilitate further discussions about those products to ensure that they are useful in a variety of ecosystems and management contexts. As for next steps after the webinar, we are recording this, and in the next couple weeks, we will make the webinar recording and the PowerPoint available online. I will distribute that once it's up. And we have a running distribution list as well for this working group. And if you are not on that, or if you're unsure if you are, just drop me a note, and we're happy to continue sharing information with you about the progress of the working group. I am now going to turn it over to Tessa Francis. Tessa is the lead ecosystem ecologist with the University of Washington and managing director of the Ocean Modeling Forum. So Tessa, want to take it away?
Thank you so much, Emily, and hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are super excited to tell you about the work that we are just beginning. As Emily mentioned, I'm a research scientist at the University of Washington, and I'm the managing director of the Ocean Modeling Forum and a co-lead on this project, and I'm joined today by Andre Punt, a professor of fisheries and the project lead at the University of Washington, and Margaret, or Megzi Sipple, a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Washington, also working with the Ocean Modeling Forum. And we'd like to just take a moment at first to introduce you to the Ocean Modeling Forum, which is being funded by the LenFest Ocean Program.
Thank you so much.
To conduct this work. I can hear somebody who has not muted their phone yet.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm muting now.
Okay, lovely to see you. Anyway, so the Ocean Modeling Forum helps managers and scientists and the ocean community use models to take on complex ocean issues. We are a small but mighty team. Our directors are Andre Punt and Phil Levin, both at the University of Washington, and Phil Levin is also with the Nature Conservancy. I'm the managing director, and we're also assisted by Genoa Soloway. And in addition to the LandFest Ocean Program, our funders and partners include the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the University of Washington, and the Pew Charitable Trust. Next slide, please. At the Ocean Modeling Forum, we really see management and managers at the heart of our work. We bring modelers, scientists, together with other participants across disciplines, across cultures, and across institutions, together with decision makers and managers to co-produce knowledge to benefit ocean ecosystems and the people who depend on them. We form diverse working groups who work together intensively over a period of usually around 2 years to address a single issue. And in this case, our working group has been formed to provide technical assistance to nations as they work to comply with the new import provision rule. Next slide, please. So next, just a bit of background on the motivation for the project. In an effort to encourage improvements in marine mammal bycatch programs elsewhere, as well as to improve the market for the United States fisheries, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, issued the Marine Mammal Protection Act import provision rule in 2016, which requires nations that export fish and fish products to the United States to adhere to bycatch standards that are comparable to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And under the rule, individual nations are to apply to NOAA for comparability finding. And the rule is really intended to hold countries that export seafood to the United States to standards similar to those in the United States. Next, please. And according to the rule, there are several conditions for making a comparability finding. Nations must assess their marine mammal stocks and the bycatch associated with each fishery subject to the rule. They must prohibit intentional killing of marine mammals, develop reporting and monitoring requirements if they do not already exist, calculate a bycatch limit equivalent to the United States potential biological removal, or PBR, about which you'll hear a bit more in detail from Andre, and have a regulatory program to reduce bycatch below that calculated limit, or importantly, develop alternative measures that are comparable in effectiveness. And these conditions, this list of required conditions, will vary depending on each fishery's area of operation. And it's also important to point out, and NOAA has pointed out, that each comparability finding will be case dependent and individually evaluated. Within the United States, there are a mix of activities that satisfy these requirements, and moving toward a more comprehensive system may be, in fact, satisfactory for a nation to receive comparability. Next, please. So, of course, the challenge that's raised by this new rule, as was pointed out in this article in the journal Science, written by our working group co-chair Rob Williams, along with his co-authors, is that many fisheries and nations that are affected by this rule have very little data on their marine mammal populations or on bycatch. So while the rule presents a great opportunity, there's also quite a big challenge to be faced by many nations in achieving a comparability finding. Next, please. So to address this challenge, the Ocean Modeling Forum, along with funding from the LandFest Ocean Program, has formed a working group to address the question of how can population impacts of marine mammal bycatch be evaluated in fisheries with poor data availability or poor data quality. Next slide, please. So the ultimate aim of our working group and this project is to identify and recommend tools that could be used by nations to assess marine mammal bycatch and its population impacts, with a particular focus on data-poor fisheries and poorly monitored marine mammals. And it's important to note that we are not planning to focus on any specific nation. We have chosen specific nations and fisheries as case studies, but these were selected to represent the breadth of challenges faced across fishery types, across gear types, across marine mammal species, and across data characteristics. And it's also important to note that the job of making final judgments or determinations about individual comparability findings is the job for NOAA and not for this group. And we're not part of the decision-making, but rather we are developing technical tools that some nations might find useful in their applications for a comparability finding. Next, please. So the working group that we have formed consists of the three of us present on the call today, plus our co-chair, Rob Williams, who is unable to join us today, along with some of the world's leading experts on marine mammal population and bycatch estimation, scientists from universities and institutions across the world, and includes scientists from NOAA as well. Our group is also being advised by representatives from NOAA who work in the department responsible for this rule. So with that just brief overview, I'd like to now turn it over to our working group co-chair, Andre Punt, to provide some more detail about the work being planned by our group. Andre?
Thank you, Tessa. Can someone hear me? I'm in Australia right now on a mobile phone, so I'm assuming that people can hear me. Tessa, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Thursday. I'm Andre Punt. I'm a professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences, as Tessa mentioned. My background is in population dynamics. Most of my research is focused on evaluating levels of sustainable take from various populations. And as one of the reasons I'm involved in this is that, like many of the other members of the working group, I've been with the member of the scientific committee of the International Whaling Commission for a couple of decades at this point. So this morning, what I'm going to do is give an outline of, roughly speaking, where we are at the moment. As was mentioned earlier, the working groups only started really getting going a couple of months ago. Which means that we know where we think we're going, but at this point, I don't have any specific results to illustrate. Essentially, the aim of the working group is, as is noted above, the wording is slightly different from Tessa's slide, but essentially our focus is on methods and on data to assist nations to evaluate the impact of bycatch, both in terms of depletion and recovery. As you'll note, and Tessa mentioned this as well, we're not specifically dealing with any evaluation. That's a NOAA responsibility, but rather we're attempting to consider methods and data and analysis approaches that can be used by a range of nations, ranging from data rich to data poor. So there's sort of three fundamental aims of the work that we're doing at the moment, and that is essentially on the two core pieces of data one uses to assess the status of any population, its trend, namely abundance and removals, in this case bycatch, and also methods for analysis, and Megzi will delve into that a bit more for one of our work products. Next slide. Okay, so Tessa mentioned the PBR, or potential biological removal method. This is an approach that's used in the U.S. for stocks for which there is sufficient data to be able to do that. The aim of the MMPA is to rebuild depleted stocks and ensure that stocks remain above their optimum sustainable population. And as part of that, there is a calculation of this number called a PBR, which is essentially the non-natural levels of removal, and that includes bycatch, but not restricted to bycatch, that could be removed from a marine mammal stock while nevertheless allowing it to reach OSP, or optimum sustainable population. It consists of three variables, so PBR equals product of three things. All of those things are part of the work group's activities. First is a population size abundance estimate, and in this case it's corrected to account for uncertainty, the productivity, and essentially a parameter that determines the rate of recovery or the accounting for risk. Just to be clear that the PBR is given here as a way to focus the working group. As I understand it, there is no requirement to use a formula like this, although of course it is a very sensible way to do that. And certainly the parameters of that formula, which I'll get to in a moment, are US specific, and as part of one of our work products, we are looking at the consequences of different values. So next slide. So the PBR, again, this is the US version, has got a number of parameters. In particular, there's a particular percentile of the sampling distribution for abundance that's used to calculate N-min. There are some default rates of increase for both cetaceans and pinnipeds, and the RF, or recovery factor, depends on species group and status of the population. For our purposes, the focus here is not on those values, but the fact that they were derived given some management goals and computer simulations, of which I show one example. So our focus is to take this at a generic level and to provide the inputs that would be needed if you were going to apply a formula like the PBR. Next slide. So our aim, and I'll go into more details in a moment, is some pictures of the working group at our first meeting there. We're aiming to create 4 work products that we will deliver by the end of the project. We'll also be identifying other projects that would be ideally conducted, although given the resources and time involved in the project, we will focus on these 4. So as a note here, the focus again is on data, in particular population size estimation and bycatch estimation, and then analysis methods. So next slide. So just a outline again of the process and where we fall into this. So this is the process that NOAA is undertaking. We are essentially at the box in the top right corner called Nations Developed Regulatory Program for Export Fisheries. NOAA does what's called the list of foreign fisheries identification, and that is, I believe, mainly done. We're hoping to provide tools that will assist nations as they conduct their development of their program. We're not involved in that bottom right box, which is the comparability finding that will be done by NOAA itself. So next slide. So we have the 4 work products. So you'll notice on the right-hand side are the 4 main areas that we're focusing on here. The first is abundance estimation. The top right there has been highlighted. So what we're planning to do is create a synthesis document that will help nations estimate abundance. There are a variety of estimation methods out there. Some of them are extremely sophisticated and require large amounts of data. But the aim of this work product, which will be a document, but also a document that contains a very practical approach to estimating abundance to assist people who perhaps are not fully trained in the latest details of how to estimate abundance using, for example, line transect and mark recapture methods. We will include in that document methods that are perhaps not ideal, but provide a basis to estimate abundance in data poor situations, including extrapolating partial estimates and using opportunistic data. So let's move to Project 2. So Project 2 is the second part of the data evaluation side of things. So this is now looking at bycatch estimation. essentially a sustainability assessment in general, not just in the context of this project, involves comparing population size with removals. Estimating bycatch is then critical to that. And so we're doing essentially an analogous document to the one we're doing for abundance estimation. Here, the focus is on how one can estimate bycatch, particularly from observer programs. That's the gold standard, but also other systems, including onboard cameras, logbooks, and potentially fish interviews with the fishes themselves. There are some situations where bycatch is non-observable, so animals interact with gear, but they are not necessarily recorded with gear, and we will try to summarize the most appropriate ways to deal with those kind of situations. And again, the aim here is to produce a document that managers and analysts who are perhaps not that familiar with the field can use. So third project. The third project is now moving into the analysis side of things. So it's developing an app, probably using R, and you'll see an example of that in Megsy's presentation. The idea here is that one will develop a set of scenarios about the population that is being impacted by bycatch, and different strategies for managing that bycatch. The idea here is this will be a very user-friendly product. It will not require knowledge of computer languages or sophisticated programming techniques, but will allow users to change inputs and examine predicted population trajectories and consequences. As Megsy will outline in more detail, the product will also, for the first time, provide a basis or a technique for estimating bycatch rates given the goals that one might wish for a management system. Again, there's no requirement that a nation adopts a particular management set of goals. This is for people to explore options. So let's move to project 4. So this is the last project that we intend to complete for the work group. As I say, if there are other ideas that come up, we will make sure that they are made aware to other people, but for our purposes, 4 is our target. So essentially, what this project involves is extending the work that was done in the development of the PBR. The primary developer of the PBR was Paul Wade, who is a member of our working group. The work that was done provided a very strong basis for evaluating bycatch implications, but there are a number of scenarios that are pertinent, particularly to the case studies that we've identified. So we're extending the PBR evaluation that Paul did, and others have done extensions as well, in particular to look at scenarios where fisheries or bycatch management relates only to a subset of the fisheries, those that would be subject to the export provisions, and also a more thorough look at stock and spatial structure. In principle, that will be the software we developed will be provided to nations, but this will not be in quite the same user-friendly mode as the app, which you will hear about in a second. So with that introduction, we're making progress on all of those work products. I'll come back in a few minutes to where the next steps are and how you can hear more about these projects. But for the moment, I'll pass it over to Megsy, who will go into more details on the project 3.
Thanks, Andre. So as Andre and Tessa mentioned earlier, the goals of this working group are 4-fold, and those are to identify candidate tools and data sets for analyzing marine mammal abundance and bycatch rates that could be used in assessments, to develop frameworks that can assess the performance of certain populations under different management strategies, to use case studies to ensure that the work we do is grounded in reality, recognizing, of course, that the range of scenarios that these tools should work for is really broad. And next, please. The work that I've been doing so far is focused on this last one, which is a set of analytical tools that can help users determine risk under different scenarios. Next slide, please. I'm working on a free open source tool that will be available to any stakeholders who are interested in using it. And this tool will use population simulations to assess risk. Next. The reasons that we're using simulations specifically is that it can be a powerful quantitative tool for exploring different management outcomes. The simulations allow us to experiment with different biological and management scenarios in cases where we might not do an actual experiment. And finally, they can help us identify important sources of uncertainty. It's also worth noting that the reference point for Bycatch in the US, potential biological removal, or PBR, was originally determined by using simulation. So what we hope to do with this project is to provide stakeholders with the benefit of population modeling and simulation in a way that's easy to use, adaptable, and transparent. Next slide, please. The way that we're planning on doing this is with an app. So the guts of the app are an age-structured population model. Next. And the inputs are basic life history information about any marine mammal population and estimates of bycatch and abundance. And then the outputs are projections of abundance into the future under different bycatch scenarios. Next slide, please. So currently, the setup of the app looks something like this. The most simple version just allows users to pick one of 4 main life history types, which are intended to capture a broad range of marine mammal life histories. They also can choose what they think the current depletion level is and pick some bycatch rates that they might want to explore. So this simple version is designed to be useful in cases where there's very little information about the life history of the marine mammal of concern. Next, please. In the second tab, they can look at projections of abundance into the future based on the bycatch rates that they chose. So on the right part of the screen, the app automatically shows results from the starting depletion that's specified by the user, one slightly higher depletion and one lower depletion, because we expect there to be some uncertainty in what the actual starting depletion is. Next, please. And this tool is also designed so that in data medium or data rich scenarios, people can add more information if they want to. So this table is just showing the default parameter values that go into the model for each of the life history types shown on the left. But in the future, users will be able to add their own life history information if that's available for their marine mammal species. Next. In the future, this app is also going to include some other tools that will help with this process. The first one will be a guide for analyzing abundance and bycatch data from different types of surveys. The second one will be a tab that allows users to evaluate the performance of their population under different management scenarios. And finally, a feature will allow them to back calculate the management changes that might help them achieve specific goals or objectives. So if people have a certain objective that they're aiming for, this tab will contain a tool that helps them determine which changes might make that possible. Next slide, please. There are a few reasons to design the tool to be kind of open-ended the way that we've designed it. One is that it's intended to be useful even when a manager or a stakeholder isn't concerned specifically with applying for a comparability finding. So we hope this tool will be useful for anyone who, any case where someone might be concerned about bycatch having a population impact on a marine mammal. Next. The other is that the people who are experts in their own systems should be able to tinker with model parameters and uncertainty and see for themselves what the impacts may be. So we expect the users of this app that they'll be experts in their own system, and with this framework, they can modify the parameters and sources of uncertainty themselves. Next, please. And finally, This tool could have an additional use as a teaching tool for students who are learning about risk assessment, management strategy evaluation, or marine mammal management. Next slide, please. So as Tessa briefly mentioned in the beginning, we're testing this framework using data from 3 different case studies. The case studies, they cover different data types, gear types, and types of marine mammals. We prioritize these countries based on seafood export value as a percentage of the country's GDP, the status of the marine mammals that are affected by fisheries in those countries, and the amount of bycatch data that are available for the specific fishery. The three case studies that we're using are gillnet fisheries in British Columbia for salmon, bottom gillnet fisheries for groundfish in Iceland, and purse seine fisheries for small pelagics in Chile. The case studies should help us make sure that this risk framework works across a diverse array of data qualities, gear types, and marine mammal species. And the working group members from each of these case study countries will provide some data and expert opinion on abundance and current bycatch rates and specific threats that might occur in their fisheries. We can also use the data from the case study countries to see whether the model projects realistic abundances based on the observations that have already been collected. Next, please. This app has some connections to the other projects that Andre mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of information already available about how to estimate abundance in bycatch from different types of survey data. And as he mentioned, projects 1 and 2 summarize and synthesize all of that information. And one of the things that we plan to do and include in the final version of this app is a guide that uses this synthesis and makes it very accessible for people to use. We're working on developing a draft version of the app to be ready for our fall meeting in November. And we've workshopped this framework with people who might use the tool to make sure it would be useful to them. But we're open to further input as well. So if you have suggestions or comments about the app or questions, please email me. My email is at the bottom of this slide. And now I'm going to hand it off to Andre, who will talk a little bit more about some of the working group's next steps.
Thanks, Megzi. It's always good to have seen some progress as quickly as we've managed on Project 3. Our next steps are outlined here, but before I get into that, just on the case studies, as Megzi noted, the case studies were chosen based on various criteria. An aim of our working group is to make sure we cover data-rich to data-poor situations. And most of those cases are on the data-rich side of or data-moderate side of the equation. One of the reasons we adopted the species that we chose and the areas we chose is that it's possible to essentially remove data or make situations more data poor when you're conducting an evaluation. So you can take a fairly data-rich situation like Iceland and essentially ask how would things perform if your surveys were less complete and higher CV. So I think that question seems to come up quite frequently. We didn't choose scenarios where we have no data at all, purely from the point of view of being able to use data to establish scenarios. So those are, we note these are slightly more data rich, but given that, you can still construct scenarios where things aren't as optimistic data-wise. And noting that we're not doing evaluations for those countries, but using the scenarios, the case studies, to ensure that our tools are appropriate. Just to outline where we're going, we're meeting again in November from the 19th to 21st in Seattle. We will by then have progress on all of our 4 work products. Megzi obviously well ahead compared to the other 3, which is pleasing. The key thing about the working group is not just that we do work, but we work with our participants to collaborate, to identify, to refine, So a significant amount of the time at the meeting in November will be to explore and review progress, identify things those who led the efforts didn't think about, and also to identify tasks for the intersessional period. As we move forward, we'll be starting to plan outputs and including obviously publications. The meetings are open. Last time, I believe we had 5 observers at various times during the work group. I know that there are 144 people on the call. I don't think we can fit 144 observers into our rooms, but we will certainly try to accommodate anybody who's interested in observing. And we have a pretty open framework so observers can communicate easily with our participants. In terms of keeping up with what's happening, I note the OMF webpage on the slide. So OMF webpage will has a page for this working group. In addition, we attempt to keep people aware of what's going on through our Twitter accounts. Next slide. It should be. More contacts. If you need to contact myself or Tessa, there are emails. In addition, Rob Williams, the co-chair, he's unfortunately not able to make this meeting, but you can contact him by email at the attached, indicated email. So I invite as many people who can attend to participate in our next working group meeting. I'm hoping that we will have lots of work to discuss and results to refine, and I do encourage people to stay aware of what we're doing, and passing it back to Emily.
Great. Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you so much to Megzi and Tessa as well for that presentation. That was really, really informative. And so now we're going to move into some questions. Again, if you have a question, type it into the Q&A panel and submit it. And so the first question, is there any concern that imposing U.S. marine mammal protection standards on our trade partners may merely serve to divert product flow and other fish-consuming nations with less stringent environmental standards?
I guess that's really a policy call. I have my own personal opinions on that topic, but our working group really doesn't have the authority, as you can imagine, to tell the U.S. what it should and shouldn't do under the MMPA. This particular rule, as I understand it, has actually been in the MMPA since the original 1972 Act. So it's a congressional decision. Yes, that could happen. Of course, the U.S. is a top market for many nations. So, but really, thankfully, our working group isn't dealing with the whether you should have this policy, but rather how best can we provide science that a nation can either improve its conservation of marine mammals or show that it's already doing a job that's consistent with the way fisheries, bycatch is managed in the United States.
Great, thank you for that, Andre. And yeah, just as a heads up to everybody, we're not able to answer questions related to the policy or the rule. So if we can stay focused on the science, so obviously appreciate everybody's interest. So the next question is from Freya Nails, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, but she says, I am looking for guidance on how to set up a robust at-sea observer program. Recognizing that there will be differences depending on the fishery, do you have recommendations for a minimum level of observer coverage to generate rates of bycatch? And just to say, she has several questions related to this, but I'll stop at that first one and let you guys jump in.
I think this one's back to me again. So I think it's fair to say that the level of observer coverage obviously determines how precise your estimate is going to be. The ideal level of observer coverage depends on what you're trying to detect as much as anything else. I don't want to try and answer that question to say, you know, for fishery X, you need 2.3%, and for fishery Y, you need 99.9%. Part of work product 1 will definitely be looking at the trade-offs at different levels of observer coverage, and also different techniques that can lead to different levels of precision. And I'll also note bias in the sense that the people tend to focus a lot on what is the CV of the bycatch estimate, but ultimately we're also concerned that on average the estimates are correct. So when designing an observer program, one's looking at both bias and variance. And work product, sorry, it was 2, not 1, will definitely be covering those topics. So I don't want to second guess what the outcome of that working group will be, but this topic will definitely be covered. If there are other questions on the same general topic, it'll be great to get that offline so I can make sure that the folks leading work product 2 definitely address those.
Great, thank you. And some of her follow-up questions actually ask about what factors should go into determining adequate level of observer coverage. Do you want to say a little bit, Andre, about the kinds of factors? Any more about that?
Yeah, I mean, usually, and again, I'm going to defer to the experts. I'm not an expert in designing observer programs. From an analysis point of view, the precision depends on the consequences as much as anything else. So if your expected bycatch is very low compared to, for example, a PBR-like number, fairly low precision will probably be okay. On the other hand, if you're close to the edge in the sense that the bycatch is high, you probably want a more precise estimate. That's a very general type of comment, but you know, those are the sorts of considerations. A broader consideration is how one distributes effort, observer effort across multiple fisheries, given constraints on overall observer coverage, and that's a more general and actually quite challenging issue to deal with, not just in marine mammal bycatch, but all observer programs. And I'd hope that when we start to see work product 1, that we have some specific guidelines on what are the best practices in that area.
Great, thanks, Andre. And yeah, if folks have very specific questions about specific fisheries, please do reach out to us offline, and we're happy to talk more. And so I'm going to move on to a question from Stephen Stowe. Is RF in the PBR formula up to the subjective judgment of the analyst computing it, or is there an objective methodology?
Hi, Steve. Interesting that we're not talking about turtles. Yeah, so within the United States, there's some guidelines on setting RF for particular groups of stocks and for stocks in different statuses. I don't recall seeing a formulaic approach to that. Obviously that is a regulatory decision ultimately, their policy calls related to that. I think for this working group, the question is how other countries might deal with that situation. I can see benefits to a national approach to RF in the sense that that might work better for a comparability finding. I can easily imagine that that would be a consideration. The tools 3 and 4 will be looking at different, the consequences of different RF values. So if a country does decide that it wishes to have taxon-specific approaches to this, one can look at the trade-offs between risk and bycatch levels. I think that's as far as I really want to take that. Some of that is getting into the policy arena.
Great, thank you. And the next question is from Liz Slutin. How soon do we expect the report on bycatch estimation to become available? And so maybe you guys want to say a little bit about timing for all the products.
Again, I think this is me. So One of the challenges of a group like this is that many of the people are volunteers. So, hi Liz, at least you're 2 hours ahead of me. I will expect to see an outline of the first two work products, where people have got to at the November meeting. Obviously, our aim is to complete all of our products within the time scale of the project, which is another 1.5 years roughly. Depending on where we are, my hope is that we will be able to produce a draft to appropriate meetings of scientists. I'm thinking, for example, the IWC's Bycatch group, HIM. If we have something to show, many of the members of the work group are in that group, and so we would present something. Having said that, I want to give people enough time to actually work on it. They are volunteers, so there are constraints there.
Great, thank you. And our next question comes from Rebecca Lentz. Are the selected case studies on the list of foreign fisheries? And also, can IWC's Bycatch working group collaborate on this with their rapid assessment work?
Hi, Rebecca. In terms of being on the list, when we started this process, that was the case. That may not be the case right now. That list is evolving a little bit, as you're probably aware. So for our purposes, in terms of bycatch estimation and abundance estimation, in some sense it doesn't really matter if they're on the list, as long as we can use those case studies to essentially evaluate the tools we're producing, noting that our job really isn't to conduct any evaluation. That's NOAA's job.
Okay, great. And we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to make sure we hit all the folks who are asking them. So if we don't get to, if you asked multiple questions, if we don't get to them, we're just trying to get more in. And again, you can always follow up. So this is from Teresa Labriola. When we assess whether a country prohibits the intentional killing of marine mammals, is that based on a fishery or a nation's actions? I am thinking particularly about Iceland, which has a whaling program and is one of your test cases.
That one, I'm afraid, really is a policy question. I would direct that one to someone at the NOAA Protected Species, exactly what their definition of a directed take would be. That's unfortunately a little beyond what the working group is dealing with. I must admit, I've asked myself the same question, because a country like Iceland does have harvest of several species, and I honestly don't know exactly how that works out. That really doesn't affect the work of the group, but you know, just generally, I'm interested in it.
Great. And this next question, this is Jeff Moore, who I assume is the Jeff Moore on the working group. We are developing an app in my lab for providing guidance on observer coverage given desired precision levels. And I think he might just be making a comment, but he leaves it there.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that will be folded into the work product number 2. I think that's an excellent thing to know about. I wasn't aware of that, but I think having that available and online for folks to see what those trade-offs are will be really beneficial.
Great. And our next question comes from Greg Donovan. So far, not much mention on the fisheries side WRT analysis of bycatch. In particular, there is not only uncertainty in marine mammal bycatch numbers, but also in fisheries effort. Will you be looking at that level of uncertainty?
Absolutely, Greg. Good morning, Greg. Yeah, so that's all part of the estimate of variance for a bycatch estimate. Estimating uncertainty in effort, of course, can be challenging in many fisheries simply because that's sort of considered a design, part of the design. But in principle, if you can quantify your uncertainty in the effort level, that will feed through into the uncertainty of the bycatch estimate. And work product 2 is definitely going to focus on both the estimate of bycatch and its precision. How accurately we can estimate that precision will depend on the data for a particular case.
Cool. And our next question is from Russell Leeper. Will your tools help in situations where there is uncertainty in population structure, such as there are only abundance or bycatch estimates for a partial component of a population, such as an individual nation's EEZ?
Yeah, thanks, Russell. So that's actually what work product 4 is attempting to address. The original work that Paul Wade did for the PBR focused on the case where you get an estimate of abundance for the entire population and you're basically managing bycatch in the whole population. Work product 4 is going to explore the consequences, we're not going to solve the problem obviously, of 2 key uncertainties. One is that the surveys and or the bycatch estimates only come from a subset of the fisheries and area. And secondly, what happens from a conservation point of view when you have, say, fisheries that are subject to the export provision, in other words, have to be managed, and other fisheries that are, for example, domestic, and in fact, they don't fall under the export provision. So, you know, what are the consequences, not from a policy point of view, but from a conservation point of view, of only applying management systems to a subset of fisheries, and for that matter, observer programs to a subset of fisheries. So, yes, we will be dealing with it. I'm hoping, in fact, by about middle of next year to have some preliminary results, at least from what is the experimental design to look at that question.
Great, and we're just going to do a couple more here. And so the next question is from Patricia Zarate, where I come from, and I believe she is from Chile, although I don't have the list of participants right in front of me. For some fisheries, we will not be able to bring more observers on board due to security aspects of the vessels and room capacity. So we will be in a position of low observer coverage. What would then be the best method to estimate bycatch in such situations?
So again, this is me. So the aims of work product 2, obviously I went through these really quickly. Work product 2 is to look at different types of methods for estimating bycatch. In particular, yes, observers are the sort of gold standard, and yes, it's not only in Chile that we have difficulties of getting observers on particularly small boats and or unsafe working conditions. There are other approaches. In particular, we're starting to look at cameras for some of our bycatch, and this is not just marine mammals. There's a cost attached to that, obviously, and I'm hoping that and expecting that work product 2 will illustrate the trade-offs between different methods, so both accuracy, precision, cost, and just ability to implement. So there are other methods, but like everything else, there's no sort of silver bullet that's going to solve all our problems. And my aim with work product 2 is at the end there will be a step-by-step guideline to help folks who are in exactly your situation.
Great, and I'm going to ask a follow-up question just from her about abundance estimates. Abundance estimations for a particular species could only be possible after several years of monitoring for sample size, but that particular species could be bycaught every year. So how do we deal with this, or how are you going to deal with that in the product?
Right. So the good news is I don't think there's any marine mammal species virtually in the world that we get abundance estimates every single year. So one of the things, as Tessa mentioned, from a comparability finding, the first thing that people are looking at, as I understand it, is that there is progress towards estimating abundance, and bycatch for that matter. So as she mentioned, movement in the right direction is critical. At the same, that's true in the U.S. Not every species is estimated, the abundance is estimated. Having said that, in addition, the techniques that both Megzi in Project 3 and myself in Project 4 are looking at will be basically using estimates of abundance that may be several years old and or computed over several years. So at least at the U.S. level, we are dealing with exactly that situation where the estimates of abundance are somewhat out of date. Obviously, for cetaceans, that's less of an issue than for a species with more rapid dynamics like a pinniped. But that's a pretty common situation. The older the estimate of abundance, the more risky things are. But one can actually do the calculations to look at that specifically, and you know, both Megzi and I'd love your input on scenarios that we can look at for projects 3 and 4.
Great, thank you so much. And this is going to be the last question, and then I'm going to conclude everything with just a couple of pieces of information that came in over the Q&A that I think will be helpful. But this last question is, PBR and similar measures include uncertainty around the population estimates. Will your proposed analysis tools also include uncertainty around the bycatch estimates?
Right. So the bycatch estimates actually don't appear directly in the PBR formula. So the PBR formula, if you look through it, has got abundance, NMIN, and FR. Where the estimate of uncertainty in the bycatch comes in is the consequences of implementation and review. So in the U.S., and again, this is not a required element of a comparability finding as I understand it, is that bycatch is compared to PBR, and that is where the uncertainty in the bycatch comes in specifically. And there's a paper myself and a couple of colleagues wrote a couple of years ago, examining that particular consequence, how different levels of uncertainty in bycatch estimates feed through into the evaluation of whether a stock is strategic. I'll also note that the uncertainty in resulting bycatch. So basically, if you try to manage for a particular level of bycatch, you're not going to get that level of bycatch. It's not a quota. And so that uncertainty is actually very consequential for the dynamics, at least in principle. And the PBR evaluations that Paul Wade did and the subsequent analyses all take that into account at different levels. I'm trying to remember, I think it was 30% attainment, basically, that if you set a PBR of 5, the actual bycatch will be plus minus 30% on that. I'd need to double check that looking at the original paper. But so we're taking into account two sources of bycatch related uncertainty: implementation of regulations and monitoring.
Great, thank you so much. We are going to conclude now, and first thing I want to share with you all, we got a note on the Q&A from NOAA, who said if there are specific questions on the MMPA import rule, they can be directed to mmpa.loff@noaa.gov. Thank you for that. And lastly, again, we're going to follow up after this. We will make the recording of the webinar available on our website, as well as a summary of the products that the group is going to produce, and the workshop summary from the group's first workshop back in May, which currently is already available on the OMF website, so you can go get that there. But we will distribute those materials after. So again, thank you so much, Andre, Tessa, Megzi. And thank you to everyone for joining us today, and do feel free to follow up. Thank you for all the questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.